find is that there's a strong argument is also regarding um, was strong arguments at the international community that we need to think about limiting the use of technologies in war, limiting the use of arms in war, in limit the actually in fact limiting the war efforts of different countries. uh, with this uh, with all these issues, we also find the emergence of transnational corporations who also became an important actor in the international developments initiatives. So transnational corporations and multinational corporations, they also became a major player in the global economy or in the world economy. And not just that they became a major player in the international economy, but also that they started influencing government decision makings in many areas. And not these transnational corporations, not only the source, not I mean they were not just the source for investment, technology transfer, or bringing foreign capital, but they also became an important actor in terms of influencing international relations, international politics. So questions arose about the nature and the purpose and the objectives of transnational corporations, whether they were simply an instrument of the colonial and the continuation of colonial exploitation in a corporate guise, or what about their interference with the host country policies or host country politics, manipulation of pricing to avoid taxation and widespread corruption? So there, the contribution or the influence of transnational corporations also became a matter of intense debate at this period. What roles the transnational corporations are playing um, in terms of violating human rights, in terms of increasing corruption, in terms of manipulating government policies, in terms of grabbing natural resources from developing countries. So all these issues kind of became important, and also you can say kind of emerged in the center stage of the dialogue between North South in terms of more equitable economic relationship between the North and the South. Concern for the environment, this is another issue that was specifically became important after the post-war period. There was a growing concern for the protection of environment and conservation of natural resources. Environmental advocates challenged the economic growth, the very idea of economic growth as the highest of all values, and started and its place in the very idea of economic growth places on the demands on the Earth's ecological resources. But there was also a call to promote alternative energy, alternative technologies or energy sources, and also use of appropriate technology in the development process. So with the very idea of the changing perception of development, the changing idea of economic growth, what we see or what we observe is that there is also a demand for the use of more sustainable technologies or alternative technologies or alternative ideas of economic growth or economic progress. An economic progress which is more inclusive, which is not exploitative towards the developing countries. And therefore, what we find is that there was also a rethinking of the very idea of economic development, not just the economic development, but also the very idea of development. The traditional assumptions and policies of economic development were increasingly questioned, increasingly reassessed, and challenged by the developing countries of the South. The dominant idea of economic development in terms of in the form of economic growth were strongly opposed, strongly challenged by countries from the South or governments or Southern governments. There was also a move away from the developmentalism, the very idea of development, or that development is only about economic growth that we kind of find in the 1950s and 1960s, where emphasis was more on economic progress, or the exploitation of natural resources for economic gain or economic profit. That idea was also challenged. And the idea behind this 1950s and 60s developmentalism was that what is best for the rich countries must also be best for the poor. So that idea that what is best for the poor, rich countries, what is best for the developed countries is also best for poor countries, or also best for developing countries, that very idea was also challenged by the developing world, the newly independent countries in the South. That's what we see, is that the focus of development shifted to include the quality of life rather than just economic growth or just economic development. So in the post-war period, what we find is a radical shift in the thinking or thinking about development, a radical shift in development thinking, how development should be achieved. What is important in terms of when you talk about economic development, when you talk about the very idea of development, that shift occurred in the with the challenges and the oppositions from mainly the newly independent developing countries of the South. Uh, with this post-war changes and post-war debate, the post-war shift in development thinking, what we also find is as an emergence of social consciousness, and also some form of institutional action at the international level. So all these changes or shifts that kind of occurred in the post-war period also brought a sea change, a radical change in how we perceive about development. In other words, the public understanding, the public consciousness about economic growth, economic progress, economic development. There is a growing recognition that development entails not just meeting human needs, but also bringing about social justice. So development, the very idea of development was translated into not just economic progress, economic growth, but the very idea of equality and justice. The link between development and human rights moved in the forefront and called for a fundamental rearrangement or reshuffling of international economic relations, and that is a more equitable international policies, more equitable national policies and national planning that will not only think about economic progress in terms of monetary benefits or economic benefits, but also about bringing more equitable society, a more just society. The end of the Cold War, the first period of the end of the Cold War, that is roughly between 1947, which you see the emergence or the establishment of the UN, and then also rapid changes or radical shift in thinking also supported the Cold War period, and the end of the Cold War also supported the emergence of more differentiated views, more divergent views, or a different understanding of the very idea of development at the international level. And this change in perception also kind of influenced on the human rights. This change in understanding also had repercussions on how we understand human rights, and how to kind of realize the human rights that were kind of prescribed in the UDHR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, with this change in focus, change in thinking, change in ideas, also there emerged two new covenants: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So what we see, there's this the making or the creation of two more covenants, which put more emphasis or a specific emphasis on civil and political rights on the one hand, and on the other, economic, social, and cultural rights. They are the product of the post-war changes, the post-war um, developments that actually influenced how we understand human rights, or how we understand the realization of human rights, or and the link between human rights and development. And the right to development, generally the advocates who propose the right to development mainly was regarded as a bridge between the civil and political rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights. And as you will find later, that how the right to development actually kind of merged or brought together these two generation of human rights, if we accept the or if we believe in the generation of human rights, the first generation human rights, which are mostly about civil and political rights, and the second generation human rights, which are economic, social, and cultural rights, then the right to development was more of a bridge or more of a linkage between these two generations of human rights. Now, how does this very idea of development or right to development actually emerge? So the post-war situation, the post-war period actually brought a radical shift in thinking, and brought a radical changes in how we perceive development, how we perceive or how we think about the realization of human rights. Now, a few other aspects are also important in terms of thinking about the emergence of the right to development. So one of the important aspect about the emergence of right to development is the new international economic order. So the formal articulation of the right to development in the form of text using human rights language or human rights terminology is actually a phenomena in the early 1970s, or the beginning of the early 1970s. So in the early 1970s, what we find is that there's an intense debate about establishing in the new international economic order at the UN level. In May 1974, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Establishment of a NIEO, which is in short form of the New International Economic Order. This new international economic order, or the declaration, actually urged that um, that a just international economic order should be based on equity, sovereignty, sovereign equality, interdependence, a common interest, and cooperation among all states, irrespective of their economic and social systems, which will correct the inequalities and redress existing injustices, make it possible to eliminate the widening gap between developed and the developing countries. A further component of the NIEO came later in 1974 with the adoption of the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. And there was a call to establish and maintain a just and equitable economic and social order. So again, we find that another important development at the international level, where countries of the South or the newly independent developing countries were urging or kind of moving forward with establishing a new economic order, which is more favorable to their economic situations, or a more favorable economic system that will help them to achieve or pursue their economic goals or social issues that were plaguing, or that were kind of became more urgent and important to address in the developing world or in the developing countries. And one important aspect is in this period was that it is continuous emphasis on the duty of the state. And as you can see, the new Charter of Economic Rights and Duties, and the emphasis was to establish and maintain a just and equitable economic order. And what does it signify is that the existing or the previous economic system or the international economic system or the international trading system was not really conducive to achieving the development objectives of the economic progress or to address or redress the social issues that were urgent for developing countries or that were plaguing the developing countries um, in terms of achieving social and the economic goals they have set in their newly enacted in their sorry in their newly enacted constitutions. Now, overall, the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, represents an important shift in the sense that it was initiated by the least developing countries of the South. Not only that, the newly independent developing countries, which are mainly poor countries in the South, they started using international law. So their attempt to use the international law and the language of obligation to actually impose certain duties uh, on the developed world, or some kind of obligation and duties to advance their claims regarding development. And what we find is that, and that is the reason in the beginning I have mentioned that the very idea of the right to development was kind of proposed by developing countries. It was a right that kind of emerged with the struggle, with the issues of progress, issues of injustice, issues of social problems from the developing countries. And accordingly, the developed world or the industrialized countries strongly oppose that whether such a right exists. And why the opposition was coming from the developed world or the industrialized countries was mainly about that the developing countries were imposing an obligation and duties on the government, on the states to actually create a more equitable and just economic relationship between the North and the South. Now, while developing nations insisted that what they have created, this new international economic order, has a legal force and has to be obeyed by all countries, including the industrialized and developed countries of the West or the North, the industrial countries or the developed countries of the North rejected the very idea that they have any duty or obligation to follow the new international economic order, or whether such an order can be created, or whether such an order is acceptable to them. However, the NIEO never mentioned the right to development, but you will find out later that there's a clear mention of the NIEO provisions that actually helped to shape the legal context for the emergence of the right to development. So it was actually the new international economic order that prompted or that kind of prepared the stage for the emergence of the right to development. For instance, Article 3.3 of the UN Declaration of the Right to Development itself affirms that a state shall fulfill their rights and duties in such a manner as to promote a new international economic order based on the observations and realization of human rights. So, what you find here, a connection between the right to development and the new international economic order that kind of emerged or that kind of established in the 1970s, and also a connection between right to development, the new international economic order, and the promotion, the protection, or the realization of human rights. Thus, the right to development emerged in the context of the UN legal framework for both the protection of human rights and the establishment of a new international economic order. So the very idea of development as a human right emerged within this broader legal framework at the UN level where a clear link or connection was made between the made between a just, equitable international order, international economic order on the one hand, and also the progressive realization, the protection and the observance of human rights on the other. Conceptualizing the development as human. How do we actually conceptualize what exactly the concept of development as human right? How do we actually kind of understand that development as a concept? Now, in the 1983, UN Special Rapporteur conducted a study on the new international economic order and the promotion of human rights. And this report actually reinforced the linkage between economic issues and the human rights. What is important in this context is that the right to development is of major importance in the context of the new international economic order. And thus, in his 1966 plea to the UN for the establishment of a new international economic order, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Senegal made the following statement. Not only we must affirm our right to development, but we must also take steps which will enable this right to become a reality. We must build a new system based not on the theoretical affirmation of the sacred rights of people and nations, but on the actual enjoyment of these rights. That is what exactly the Senegalese foreign minister actually stated in the context of, or in his plea for establishing a new international economic order. Thus, the key figure in the reconceptualization, how the very idea of development was reconceptualized as a human right, the credit actually goes to the Senegalese jurist, the Keba Empire, and he actually, for the first time, proposed this very idea that development should be understood as a form of human rights. He asserted that the right to development is a right of all men, as every man has a right to live and a right to live better. So how he conceptualized the very idea of development is not just in terms of economic growth or economic progress or economic development, but more of the rights of all men to live and also to live in a better way, a better world, a better society, a society, a just economic order, or a just economic relationship between the North and the South. That's how he understood or conceptualized the very idea of development as a human right. In later period, what we find is that on the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, the UN Commission on Human Rights was absolutely influenced by Mbaye's views, expressly referred to the right to development in a resolution adopted in 1977. Further, the Commission on Human Rights, Resolution number 4 of 2nd March 1979, expressly recognized the right to development as a human right and asked the Secretary General to study the condition required for the effective enjoyment of the of rights by all people and individuals. In 1981, the UN convened a working group of governmental experts on the right to development and later asked the working group to prepare a draft of the right to development. Eventually, on December 4, 1986, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to adopt the Declaration on the Right to Development. The preamble of the UN, the newly declared um, Declaration on the Right to Development, recognizes that Development is a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process which aims at active, free, and meaningful participation in development and the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. So, what you find here is that the emphasis is not just on economic progress or economic development, but a comprehensive um, development that includes economic, social, cultural, and political development. Not only that, the emphasis is also on process, not just on the protection or the realization. But the very idea of development as a process is understood as a as a as an obligation or as a kind of duty of all countries at the national as well as international level. And if this process is actually adopted and followed, then ultimately a comprehensive development of all peoples, all human person can actually be achieved. That was the idea expressed in the preamble of the UN DRD. Now, how do we actually conceptualize? So, on the one hand, we find that initially it was reconceptualized, or you can say reconceptualized, by the Senegalese jurist by bringing together the very idea of development with the human rights. And then we find a concrete manifestation, a concrete articulation of the development as a human right in the UN Declaration. And therefore, in the UN Declaration, what we find is that the right to development is an inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all persons are entitled to participate in and contribute to and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. Now, what we find in this very broad, sometimes some scholars have actually said is a very vague articulation of the idea of human rights or the idea of development as a human rights. So how do we actually understand the very concept of development and what exactly we find from this very broad, vague articulation of human rights or the idea of development? The first is that there is a human right. So development is a human right. Okay. So right to development is a human right, and this right is inalienable, means it cannot be taken away from anyone. Then there is a process of economic, social, and cultural and political development. So development is not just achieving the economic progress or economic development, but rather it's a process which is recognized uh, in which that all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. So development has been defined or designated as a form of process, and within the process, and if this process is followed, then ultimately lead to the realization of fundamental freedoms and human rights. The subsequent articles in the declaration also clarify the nature of this process of development. For example, Article 1 recognizes that not only every human person, but all persons are entitled to development. So it is not just a human person, but all people. So what exactly the meaning of or the difference between using the two language or two phrases, one not just human person, but all people? Um, so that is again a matter, again and again, something which you need to kind of clarify, which you need to really understand. Now, Article 1, Clause 2 of the Declaration, it is clearly or expressly mentioned that the rights of people to self-determination. So that is again something which comes within the very idea of development as a human right, the right of self-determination. We also find that the human person who is central subject of development in the sense that active and the beneficiary of the right to development. So who is the beneficiary and who is the participant in development? It is the human person. Okay. The process of development, again, which has been kind of elaborated in other articles. So human rights and all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized only if we look into Article 2, Clause 3, that is the constant improvement on the well-being of entire population of all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. So what you can see here that and the process of development is not just a top-down approach or top-down process where the West and whether the Western countries or the developed countries will bring development or progress to the developing world, but it is more of a participatory nature. So everyone will participate in the process of development. And that's where it leads to our discussion when I mentioned in the beginning that a particular dam project in Indonesia where a large number of people were kind of displaced and they were never given adequate compensation. They were never discussed about the project. The taking of property, taking their villages were never really negotiated with those people. So what we find here is that in a specific development project, whether a specific development project can bring some form of development, but the question arises whether whether the people for whom that development project was actually started or that development project was actually kind of created or initiated were actually consulted, whether the people actually participated in the negotiation process. So whether the development project is actually a participatory development project. So the two examples I have given in the beginning, in both the examples, what you find is that in the Kenyan case, um, where the land of the ancestral land of the Indroas community was taken for some development projects to construct a game reserve and a tourist attraction. But the question arises that whether the Indroas community or the indigenous community of the Indroas people were actually given an opportunity to participate in the development project. Whether the development project initiated by the Kenyan government was actually a participatory development project, whether people whose for whose development the project was initiated, whether they received the benefit resulting from the development project. But in both the cases, in Kenyan case, in the Indonesian case, what we find that people were kind of uh, um, in the Kenyan case, a large number of people were displaced. In the same situation in the Indonesian case. So what we find here is that, first of all, that those development projects were not really a participatory development project. Secondly, in both the project, development was not really a process that were kind of a process where where people can actually participate in terms of negotiating, in terms of discussing what is beneficial for them, whether whether the development project is actually going to benefit to them, and further, whatever benefit was going to be achieved from those development projects, whether the people who were kind of whose land was encroached, whose land was taken, who became displaced, whether they received any form of benefit from those projects. Now, Article 8 of the Declaration elaborates this point very clearly. It says that the measures for realizing the right to development shall ensure equality of opportunity for all. So the whether both these development projects actually provided equal opportunities to those people whose rights, whose land were affected by the project. So whether actually the people, all people, or the human person actually were given an equal opportunity to participate in the development process, whether they were given an opportunity to discuss what kind of benefits are going to arise, or what kind of benefits they are going to receive from those development projects. Now, equal opportunity is not just limited to the protection of human rights or the very idea of development as a human right, or what we can say here is that the idea of development as a human rights not just limited to only the participation of all human beings or all people in the development process, but um, also giving access or providing access to all the basic resources such as education, health services, food, housing, employment, and in the fair distribution of income. So, what we kind of understand from this the very concept of the right to development is that that development um, um, is a process where both the people, the government, the state, and even the international community must create an environment where everyone can participate in a manner that will only promote and promote the observance of human rights, promote the protection and the realization of all the fundamental freedoms of all people living in a particular country or even living in a particular community. Now, to realize this process of development, there are responsibilities. And who will bear those responsibilities? Who actually has the responsibility to create the process? Who actually has the responsibility to actually um, um, provide those services, the protection of human rights or the realization of the human rights, or who actually has a duty to create an equal opportunity for everyone in terms of providing all the services or access to all the services, the food, the housing, the employment. Now, what we find in terms of conceptual clarification is that the principal focus of the declaration is upon the state. So therefore, it is a responsibility of the state or the states or the both at the national at the international level, and therefore it is not just the developing countries government, but both the countries from the developing world as well as from the developed world both have the responsibilities to create a condition, create an environment where every human being can actually participate in the process of development. However, the main responsibility remains with the states at both at the national level, at the international level, to create that process, to create an environment that will actually bring that process of development. There is, however, an important individual dimension. Human beings also have a duty, individually as well as collectively, to promote an appropriate political, social, economic order for development. So the duty or the responsibility is not just upon the states, but also individual. The human beings as individuals also have the responsibility in as a collective, like as a community, or even as an individual human being has a responsibility to create that kind of an economic, social or political order for development. Nevertheless, what we can say is that it is the states have the primary responsibility to create national and international conditions favorable for the realization of the right to development. So the UN Declaration on the Right to Development also specifies several collective obligations of a state. So not just one single state, but states as a collective or as a collective members of the international community, states actually have a number of obligations. First of all, cooperate in ensuring development and eliminating obstacles to development. Secondly, eliminate massive and flagrant violation of human rights. Thirdly, respect the principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperate among states. The fourth, take steps to formulate international development policies with a view to facilitating the full realization of the right to development. Okay. So, and fifth, promote universal respect for and the observance of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. And lastly, promote the establishment of international peace and security. So, from the from the reading of the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, what we find that the primary obligations or the primary responsibilities are with the state to create a process where all human beings, or all human persons, or all people can actually participate in a free manner, and in a process of in a social, economic, and political process or an order where everyone can participate in promoting the very idea of development, or in terms of in terms of protecting their rights and freedoms, with the hope that the very idea of development will lead to the very idea of development as a human right will actually lead to the realization of all human rights prescribed in national documents or in national constitutions, and also at the international level. So that's where I just stop today in terms of discussing um, the very idea or the concept of the development, or the right to development as a human right. And also kind of, I have pointed out or kind of discussed this, the historical context, the background of how the very idea of development as a human right emerged in the post-war period, and then its concrete manifestation or articulation with the establishment of a new international economic order, which was obviously never successful, or actually the very idea of a new international economic order was never really realized, or never really accepted by the developed countries. However, this very understanding of establishment of a new international economic order actually provided a platform or created a space for the emergence of the right to development as a human right. And then, obviously, in the 1986, we find a concrete manifestation or a concrete articulation in the UN text, which brought together, or kind of for the first time in a legal document, in an international legal document, and the very idea of development as a human right was recognized. And what exactly this multifaceted concept of development as a human right was proposed and prescribed and promoted in the international community, and more specifically in the area of international human rights law. So that's where I stop today. We'll continue tomorrow regarding some principles of some of the principles or some of the ideas that kind of emerged from the very idea of development as a human right, and how those ideas or principles were actually implemented in practice, and what exactly the current practice in the national context, or in a different country context, and also at the international level, that we will discuss tomorrow.
All right, Dr. Mizanur, thank you so much for providing a very excellent explanation about development as human rights. It's already 9 p.m. today. Is it still okay if we have one question, or would you prefer to save it for tomorrow?
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize, actually. Sorry, Anissa, I didn't realize that. Is there a time difference? So I was looking into the time, but I didn't realize that we are actually close to the time. So I thought that I'll finish a little bit early and give some time for questions. But it's already 9, but I'm fine. If anyone wants to ask any question, I'll be happy to kind of answer or clarify. So it's still fine for me. No problem at all.
Alright, sir. If it's so, then adik-adik, mahasiswa sekalian, apakah ada yang ingin bertanya? Seharusnya memang sudah selesai karena sudah memasuki jam 9, tapi Dr. Mizanur bersedia untuk meluangkan waktu untuk satu pertanyaan mungkin ya. If anyone wants to ask question directly, feel free to raise hands and we can arrange for you to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. But if you are still shy or have a language barrier, it's still okay if you write it down on chat section. Okay, sir, we already have one person who raised hands and want to ask you directly. Please, Jose, tell us what your question is.
Okay, thank you, sir, for your explanation. It's such a good explanation for me, and it's a pleasure for me to ask you this question. Sir, I want to ask you about the states that have a primary responsibility to create a national and international condition favorable to the resolutions of the right of development. So, wait a minute. I want to ask you this. I want to ask you a simple question that that sometimes there are so many differences in the in the theory and it's practical. Like maybe when the government had a plan to extend the road, but it'll make many houses got evicted. So my question is, do you think if they discuss the development together with the government would make the process better, and would it violate their human rights if the government denied to discuss about the plan together?
Yeah, so I think you raised a very important issue or an important question regarding the two conflicting nature of the very idea of development. So on the one hand, governments or states wants to governments or many states actually want to promote a development project which is actually going to be beneficial for the larger public, for the larger population. And on the other hand, if because of that development project, a small community is kind of affected or kind of left behind. So the very idea of development is promoted or kind of prescribed in the right to development, and the UN Declaration on the Right to Development is more about the participatory or you can say an inclusive nature of development process. So what the declaration is actually talks about is that development is not a top-down approach, that development is imposed by a certain authority, whether that is the government or a particular country or even the international community or even an international organization or financial institution. But rather, it is an inclusive process where all the stakeholders must participate in the development process. So coming to your question that in a practical situation or in a practical context, how can a government initiate a project or start a development project where certain communities, certain people will actually be left behind or kind of will not be their views or their opinions will not be taken into account. But I will say that it is more about the participatory nature of a development process. So the government or the states have a duty to actually make the development process more inclusive, more participatory. So where the communities who are going to be affected by any means or by any way or because of the development project or the proposed development project, they should the government must negotiate or discuss the project with them, must elaborate, must clarify how they are going to benefit from the project, what kind of benefits the project will bring to them. So they must give their they must participate in the process. They must be given an opportunity to discuss, to negotiate that what compensation or what damages they are going to be provided, what alternative alternative means, alternative benefits or alternative opportunities will be provided to them. So it is more about, it is not just about enforcing or kind of imposing a top-down development project on a particular community or on the people, but the question here arises whether a particular development process, whether that is at the national level or at the international level, how the people, because development is for the people, it is the people who has the right, an inalienable right to enjoy the fruits of development, the process of development, the protection of their right to development, and the people have the right to self-determine. So they have a right to decide whether they actually want to participate in the development project, whether they want the development proposed by the government. If the people or the community do not want a development project because it's going to be harmful for them, is not going to provide any benefits to them, then obviously the government must think about alternatives. So it is not just about the government makes a decision and that decision is final and should be imposed on people, but rather governments need to think about an alternative proposal, an alternative project, or probably giving an opportunity to the affected community how the project is beneficial for them and what kind of benefits the project is going to bring, not just for them, but for the larger public. So I will say that development is not just for the benefit of the larger public and a few people who will be left behind, but it should be more inclusive. So in terms of implementing, in terms of initiating, in terms of realizing any development project, government must consult, must discuss with the affected community, and must convince or must demonstrate, must show how the project is going to be beneficial for all the people, not just a few people. So yes, it's a tricky, a very tricky and complex situation, but development must be an inclusive development. It must not, a development project must not be implemented or realized at the cost of people who will be displaced, who will lose their livelihoods, who will lose their rights, who will lose their resources. So, and development should not be at the cost of the people's life, at the cost of people's rights, the cost of people's resources and livelihood. So that's what I kind of like to say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mizanur. I think that's sum up your question very well, Jose. Okay, and then let us conclude our first session today and prepare for the next session tomorrow at the same time with the topic Development as Human Rights, Current Practices. Thank you so much, Dr. Mizanur, for providing an insightful and comprehensive explanation of the intersection of human rights and development. It is truly fascinating to observe the collision and overlap between these two fundamental concepts, as you elaborated earlier, and the ongoing debate among experts. Both are of equal importance, and it is imperative to find a middle ground where they complement each other, ensuring that one does not overshadow the other. And I thought this is what the UN Declaration on the Right to Development strives to accommodate and continuously develop to enhance its enforcement and comprehensiveness. A special thank you to our guest lecturer once again, who has generously shared their impressive knowledge with us tonight. Have a restful evening, sir, as we have 2 more sessions to conduct in the coming days. I'd like to also express our gratitude to all the students and participants who have faithfully attended this event from start to finish. We hope to see you all in the remaining 2 sessions. Yeah, we start with 100 people, Sir Mizanur, and at the end of this session, there's still 86% on the Zoom meeting and 10% on YouTube. So it's a cool number for me. And on behalf of the organizing committee, I apologize for the technical issues that occurred at the beginning of today's session. Rest assured, everyone, the technical issue will be better. We will make sure that the technical issues will not happen again in the tomorrow. So everyone, rest assured, it will be. We're looking forward to see you in the next session tomorrow. Thank you and have a good rest, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Mizanur. Should we take a picture together before closing?
Sure.
Okay. If you still have time, Dr. Mizanur, then let's take a
No, I
picture.
have time, no problem, because generally it's already close to evening. This is the last thing I'm doing, so no issues at all.
Okay. So everyone, make yourself look better for the photo session. Yeah, we wish you can join us to capture the moment. Sir Mizanur already came through online meeting far away from Baghdad, if I'm not mistaken, right, Doctor? Yes. So okay, let's take a picture. First slide. 1, 2, and 3. And then the second session.
See you tomorrow evening, everyone. I hope the session was good because I mean, to some extent, some of the discussion was a bit historical, was a bit theoretical, but that's the nature of the today's topic. It was more about discussing the theoretical context, the historical context, the conceptual development, the way we understand development. Hopefully, for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow would be much more focus on practical applications with more examples from Indonesia, from other parts of the world as well, from India, from many other countries in Africa. So hopefully we will have more chance to discuss the contentious, more debatable issues in the area of development, and how those projects actually affect people's right, and what is happening at the international level, at the UN level, at the regional level, or how actually people are negotiating their right to development with the states, with the government, with the local authorities. Because as far as I know, that in Indonesia there is a local authority law which has been passed, and which talks about what the local authorities actually need to follow or need to observe in terms of initiating any development project. So which I'll kind of look into later in the third session. Hopefully it was not so boring, I guess, because sometimes discussing a complex topic theoretically or kind of online sometimes makes it boring to actually because we are in an online environment, and we cannot really interact face to face. So things can sometimes the discussion might be a bit boring, might be difficult to follow, might be difficult to understand, but is the nature of the topic or the nature of the online environment which makes it a bit difficult to make the session a more interactive or more interesting. So that's kind of I want to say.
Yeah.
But hopefully it was kind of at least helped the student to actually understand the topic. Hopefully, I hope that.
Yes, sir. To make tomorrow's session becoming more interesting, perhaps all the students can do their own research, basically
Yes,
about
sure.
Rempang, perhaps. Kan mata kuliah kita hari ini adalah hukum dan HAM spesifik mengenai benturan antara pembangunan dengan hukum dan kemanusiaan ya, human rights tadi kan. Nah, jadi mungkin spesifik isu yang masih viral di Indonesia adalah tentang Rempang. Nah, mungkin beberapa dari kalian boleh membaca dan kemudian tipis-tipis presentasi pada Pak Mizanur nanti ketika sesi tanya jawab untuk melihat perbandingan yang terjadi di Indonesia dengan di luar negeri itu seperti apa gitu, sehingga kita masing-masing punya bekal gitu untuk mengikuti next session gitu, tidak terlalu bingung dan bisa mengikuti keep up with the explanation that Dr. Mizanur provide us very well.
Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow, everyone. Have a nice rest, everyone. Please leave the room, or perhaps the host can end meeting for all, I guess.